It is with great joy tonight as we have been meditating on this theme of joy, but also understanding the reality that depression and suicide is real. And tonight we are going to receive, we are going to encounter, we are going to be open to the Spirit in what we are going to learn and also hear tonight. It is with honor to introduce our speakers. The three of them will be sharing. Our first speaker is Dr. Reilly, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in children, adolescents, and families. Dr. Reilly is the Associate Director of the Freedom Center for Child and Family Development at William James College. She also has done many work and research and practice within behavioral health and pediatric integration, school climate and social emotional learning, system change, treatment of anxiety and depression. With her, we also have our very own Dr. Farmer, Sarah Farmer, who is on the faculty here at Yale Divinity School as Associate Research Scholar at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And I can't believe how fast the year has gone by, because last year we celebrated her PhD and having her graduate and have her be with us already. But her dissertation is one that speaks of hope and confinement, moving toward a pedagogy of restorative hope, and her work has been centered around Black youth in inner cities, and there's a lot we can learn from her. And also, we have with us tonight one of my beloved friends, my sidekick here with YMI, Miss Kate Hyde, who is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in mental health psychotherapy for children, adolescents, and families. She completed her graduate work at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University and held a clinical fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. Please join me in welcoming these fabulous, fabulous women of God who are going to share and deposit something to us with us tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being with us here tonight to talk about this very difficult but very, very important topics of depression and suicide. Before we get started, we wanted to just invite you to find some joy in watching the three of us shuffle behind the podium a little bit. Is there some feedback? So, we're coming together tonight as mostly adults to talk about the youth, and we wanted to start with honoring their voice by hearing some of the words that a real adolescent wrote to her journal that shows us a little bit about what the internal experience is for the adolescents who are suffering from depression. So I'd just like to invite you to close your eyes and listen to the words of this young person. I seriously can't explain it, but I hate everything about the way I think. I wish I was such a different person. Not my life different, or even my physical appearance, but I wish I could steal someone else's head, their brain. I wish I could take control of my thoughts. It's so frustrating. So Sarah and Nadja and I would like to get a sense of what your experience is with the youth you work with. So if you would please raise your hand if you are or have worked with an adolescent diagnosed with clinical depression. Okay. Now please raise your hand if you are working with an adolescent right now who you are really worried about. So if you had a look around the room when we raised hands, you can see that this is a very concerning problem. And the research is telling us that adolescent depression is on the rise. You may know that 1 in 10 adolescents will experience a mental illness that will impact their functioning. And we think those estimates are actually quite low. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescence in the U.S. And this is not just in the U.S., this is a worldwide problem too. Depression is the leading cause of mortality and morbidity for people over the age of 5 worldwide. So I want you to just take a minute and reflect on that. Why do you think this is happening? What are you seeing in the youth that you work with that may be leading to these increases that we're seeing? On your table, you'll find a note card. We'd like you to think about that question and write an answer, something that you think, something that you're seeing in your youth. So you probably came here tonight because you had questions. You have concerns about someone you're working with right now. Can everyone hear me? And we hope that we can answer those questions for you tonight. But we want you to take a minute now and reflect on what big questions did you come here tonight with? What is something that you want answered? And on the back side of your card, could you please write your question? This is a very big topic, and we can't promise you that we're going to answer it tonight, but we are certainly going to try. And you can be assured that if we don't, we are going to collect these note cards, and Sarah and Nadja and I will be incorporating those questions that you have into the curriculum and the chapter we will be writing together. And we hope that one of the things that you hear tonight is the hope that depression is treatable and suicide is preventable.
So good evening, everybody. I am so excited to be here today, particularly because as a psychologist, I don't get the opportunity to have communication with people in different fields, and this to me is such a blessing in being able to broaden my own ideas about depression and really be able to talk about kids in a way that incorporates their emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. So I thank you for this opportunity. We also thank the Templeton Joy and the Good Life Grant for allowing us the opportunity to begin to create an innovative approach that combines the theological aspects of understanding depression with the psychological aspects to really create a more complete and, we hope, a better treatment approach for youth who are struggling with depression. We're excited to share with you these initial thoughts that we have, and we look forward to the opportunity to sharing even more in-depth information with you. We want to just tell you a bit about what we're hoping to accomplish tonight. One is to really share with you our vision of how to integrate psychology and theology to shed light on how to promote joy and the flourishing life for adolescents. We also want to describe for you what suffering means in the context of adolescent depression. And in doing that, we're going to provide very concrete information about what depression looks like so you can identify it, but also some strategies that you can use in your work with youth. And finally, we want to propose some ways that youth groups can create a community of flourishing that support adolescents, whether they're experiencing emotional health and joy at its fullest, or whether they're really at a moment of crisis. But despite where they might be in that range, that community of flourishing will be a safe space where they know that they can always be held and supported. Now, as Kate indicated in the beginning, we're talking about depression and suicide. And these topics, of course, will have likely either touched you personally or someone that you know. So we understand the emotional impact that sometimes it can have. So if you happen to need to take a moment for yourself, or if there is something that you just need to take a breather, come back. We invite you to do whatever is good for you to take care of yourself as we join each other in this conversation.
So we could just be talking about depression and talking about the symptoms of depression and identifying warning signs and causes of depression. But we have the theology of joy grant, so that's not what we're doing. What we are doing is trying to put depression and suicide in the same conversation with joy and flourishing. And that's what we do as youth ministers, right? That's what we do as the community of faith. And so in order to begin that conversation, I really want to begin to kind of define the terms. I think we're all on the same page. We don't just want youth to survive. We want youth to flourish. And so I want to introduce you to what we've been working with in our center. The Yale Center of Faith and Culture and Miroslav Volf and my colleagues, they have created this definition of what a flourishing life is. And it's really more of a hypothesis that's kind of being tested. And as we test it, we kind of refine it. So I'm going to also share some of my refinements with you today. But basically, this hypothesis says a flourishing life has 3 dimensions: the agentic dimension, the affective dimension, and the circumstantial dimension. The agentic dimension is really talking about agency. The phrase that's often used with this dimension is, it's about what you do. It's about a life led well. And leading life well is about how you live in the world, how you conduct yourself in the world. It's about the right disposition, the right attitude, the right stance, the right posture. It's even about how we receive God's gifts, receiving God's gifts rightly. And then the next dimension is what's called circumstantial. The phrase that's often used with that is a life that goes well. It's talking about the material and cultural conditions by which we live. Oftentimes, the circumstantial is something that we can't necessarily control. It might be the family you were born in. It might be the neighborhood you grew up in. That's what the circumstantial is about. But the word we've been using to describe the circumstantial and flourishing is the word shalom. It's a Hebrew word that means peace. And the Hebrew kind of definition of it is nothing missing, nothing broken. And so circumstantial flourishing looks like this ideal of shalom. And then finally is the affective dimension. And the phrase we've been using with that in the center is a life that feels well. And for Miroslav, this definition is really grounded in how one responds to God's gifts. Now, let me be honest. When we talk about this definition in the context of depression and suicide, that's a really hard definition to work with. And so as we've been in conversation, I really have begun to think a little differently about the affective dimension of this. What we've begun to say is a flourishing life is it actually is the ability to feel a wide range of emotions, including a life feeling well. And what I mean by that is to be human is to feel. That means to feel sadness, to feel joy, to feel confused at times, to be able to really experience that wide range of emotions. And so that's the kind of definition that we begin to think about when we think about the affective dimension is that really to enjoy a flourishing life, you really have to be able to experience the full range of emotions. And what that allows is even when someone is experiencing hardship, they can also experience a flourishing life. And so what does joy look like that is robust enough to take into account this wide range of emotions? For me, the definition I really have kind of grown to love is Mary Clark Michella's definition. She's a pastoral theologian here at Yale, and she wrote a book that's recently come out called Caring for Joy, Narrative, Practice, and Theology. And what she talks about is, yes, joy is an emotion, but joy is also a spiritual path. It's a way of perceiving. In some cases, it's a disposition even. This kind of joy actually encompasses sorrow, holding a place for it, and at the same time, containing it. Such a path involves feeling one's way toward all the goodness and grace one can find or forge together with others in communities of solidarity. This kind of joy is a path of life that involves living in relationship to all there is. And so beyond an emotion, this kind of spiritual path, it doesn't preclude sorrow, but it includes it. It includes figuring out your way in the midst of sorrow. It's about journeying together. It's a pathway. And so my own articulation of what joy is, both from Mary Clark Michella's definition, being influenced by her, and also from my work around hope with incarcerated women, is really joy. A simple way of saying is joy is hope that has come alive because of, in response to, and in spite of all that we encounter.
And so what a beautiful definition, because it really allows us to reflect on the real condition that emotional states are not always clean and positive and negative, but it's really a complicated space that often holds both. And we'd like to start now talking a little bit more about what is the relationship between joy and suffering. And we're defining today that suffering as depression. Thank you. So a lot of times people ask me the question, so where does depression come from? How is it that children, how is it that adolescents can develop depression? And the reality is that it's a combination of different factors that come together. About 50 years ago, people actually thought that children couldn't even develop depression because their personalities were not developed sufficiently to hold such an intense state of suffering. And we know that's not the case. And we also know it's not the case that it's just a single trigger that leads to the development of depression. What we know is that there are numerous things that contribute to the development of these feelings. If we take a look at this model, it's really where those circles meet in the middle that is the particular trigger point for an adolescent. Now, unfortunately, we haven't yet found a formula that says 2 of one circle and 1 of one circle and 3 of the other. It's really a very individual process for each person. But what we know is that risk factors associated with each of those domains, if severe enough and if prolonged enough, can really contribute to the development of depression. If we take a look at the biological sphere, for example, things like genetics play a very big role. And so we know, for example, that depression is highly heritable. We know that particular mood disorders, such as bipolar disorder, are even more so, so that if a parent has a diagnosis of bipolar depression, a child is 5 times more likely to develop the disability. We also know that chronic health conditions or other disabilities might also serve as risk factors. In the social domain, and this one is so important in youth because the social piece is such a critical part of their development and identity at this time, We know that difficulties in social relationships, we know that being left out or being bullied or significant changes, losses of parents, we know that those are tremendous risk factors. In fact, for children and adolescents, one of the biggest risk factors for depression is the loss of a parent. Now, I don't know how many of you are currently working with children and adolescents that have experienced a lot of loss, but for me, it feels like it has just been such a prevalent theme in working with kids. So again, thinking about from a social perspective, what other disruptions have been going on? From a psychological perspective, if kids don't feel like they have good coping skills, they will turn to short-term alternatives that in the moment feel good and take away that pain, but in the long term, it doesn't really remove it or resolve it. So things like substance use or things like cutting, those coping skills are not healthy in the long term. So we need to teach them. We need to model these things for them. And from a spiritual perspective, it's so important to have that connection to feeling like you are supported and loved and held in faith by a higher power. And we know from the literature that takes a look at youth development that those kids who are involved in some sort of practice of service or some sort of practice of feeling connected to spiritual concerns, in whatever manifestation it takes, actually do much better from an emotional perspective. So when that is feeling like it's a lack in their lives, it can certainly contribute to the sense of meaningless or feeling alone. Now, we've been talking a lot about depression as this thing, right, as this abstract concept. So I wanted to really delve a little deeper into what those symptoms actually look like. I'm sure that when you talk to adolescents who perhaps have not had direct experience with what depression is, they still have these misconceptions about what symptoms look like, or what treatment is like, or what they do. And so one of the things that we think is so important is to share with them, this is what it looks like, and this is not a normal part of your adolescent experience. So what are these symptoms? Now, we usually see more conventionally in the media that people who are depressed are crying a lot and they're withdrawn. And actually, for kids and adolescents, that is not the first thing we see. We see a lot of irritability, snapping back at people, having short tempers, maybe getting in trouble at school, getting trouble at home. You'll hear often, I don't understand what's going on. He's just snapping back at me, or, they're at each other's throats, these siblings, and I don't get what's going on. So that irritability, because that pain is internal, often for adolescents will come out as anger. There's a decreased interest or pleasure in almost all activities. And now this one is important to listen to in a different way, because it's not typical that kids will say, I'm really not enjoying anything. You'll hear things more like, this is so boring. This stupid, I don't want to do it. I don't even want to try that. It's not what I want to do. And so you start hearing this removal from connections because they're just not feeling like they can be who they are in that space. There's a significant weight loss or gain, and I would say, this is a period when we're getting kids during puberty, so weight gain is actually part of what's expected. I would be more on the lookout for pretty significant weight loss, or if kids are really not thriving and meeting developmental milestones. Sleeping too much or sleeping too little. Now, how many of you have that little voice in your head before you go to bed, and it's like, oop, forgot to do this, got to do this. Oh, I didn't do that right. Oh, my goodness. And it kind of keeps you awake. Imagine that amplified by self-deprecating thoughts and by worries that this is not going to get better. That is the internal dialogue that really keeps kids from sleeping or that disrupts their cycles. Many say they're agitated, so I can't sit still, a lot of fidgetiness, or else they feel like they're completely drained of energy. So a lot of us have done work in schools, and I can always tell the kids who are struggling because they're frequent flyers at the nurse's office, and they're always complaining about feeling like I'm fatigued. I feel like I have the flu, or I feel like I have mono. You hear a lot of physical complaints. There's an incredible sense of worthlessness or excessive guilt, and that comes across as statements like, I'm really sorry that I messed up group for us tonight. I know that I should have been more prepared, and group would have been so much better if it hadn't been for me. Right? Difficulty concentrating, thinking, making decisions, remembering things. You know when you're stressed and you're looking for your glasses and they're on top of your head? Our cognitive functioning gets impacted by stress. Depression really takes a toll on cognitive symptoms. So when kids are struggling in school, it's because they're having a hard time remembering. It's because they're having a hard time processing into something new. So things like a book report, things like group projects feel awful for them. And finally, for some kids, they might experience recurrent thoughts of death. The worthlessness, hopelessness, and inability to feel connected are often the triggering symptoms for those thoughts. And we often hear a lot from kids, I'm so depressed, oh, this is so depressing. And we tell them, when you say that, are you talking about feeling like that for a moment? Or are you talking about when those symptoms are too frequent, they last for too long, and they're too intense to be able to do anything about it? And for you working with your kids, if you're seeing this pattern for at least 2 weeks or longer, that's always a good rule of thumb to remember. 2 weeks or longer, no break in between, you're kind of seeing this pretty consistently, that is a great time to be able to ask and start inquiring about what might be going on. Before I forget, we all come from very different backgrounds, cultures, races, and it's important to be mindful that the experience, the understanding of depression varies. And so I invite you to think about these as sort of the core symptoms of depression, but really think about how might these symptoms manifest in different ways. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I remember my family saying, oh, well, yeah, and we had the crazy grandmother. We never quite knew what to expect from her, right? And nobody talks about it. She's the crazy grandmother. There was no diagnosis, but there was also no talking about it, and the expression was, we need to help her separately. So thinking about how do families talk about it, how they initiate the conversations, and behaviorally, what might you see in kids first?
So as Nadja said, that we kind of think of those as the core symptoms of depression. And when we diagnose someone with clinical depression, we categorize it as either mild, moderate, or severe. So the core symptoms stay the same, but the severity changes. So for an adolescent who is dealing with mild or moderate depression, their symptoms may be fewer, or they may come less frequently. They may have more times during the day or during the week where they feel better, where they are laughing or engaging with their friends or getting good grades in school. The impact on their functioning may not be as significant. And a lot of times these are the kids who get overlooked because it doesn't match up with some of the misconceptions about depression. As Nadja mentioned, a lot of times we hear that depressed kids can't get out of bed and they cry all the time. But that's not true for everyone. And I think it's very important that we talk about the kids who are suffering at this end of the spectrum as well. I recently was working with a young man who I diagnosed with depression, and he was probably more in the moderate area. And his parents were not convinced that this is what he was experiencing. And just a few weeks later, he was talking about thoughts of suicide and wanting to hurt himself. And when I spoke to his mother, she said, But I don't understand. His grades are fine. I saw him laughing with his friends the other day. I really didn't think he was depressed. And this is what we need to listen for, because they can present and function and find joy and still be dealing with depression and be suffering. On the other end of the spectrum, we have adolescents who may not be able to get out of bed, who may have their functioning impacted on a lot of different levels, at school, socially, at home, even self-care. And at this end of the spectrum is when we see a lot more thoughts of suicide, suicide attempts, and the concerns for their safety. So we would like to point out for you some of the warning signs of suicide.
I would just like to also bring up the fact about how early this can be presented also, from what I learned, which we're going to share that, how young.
How young children will manifest this? Well, I can say that the youngest child that I've ever worked with was 4. Yeah, so very early. And as Nadja said, we understand much more now about the symptoms and the way they present, because for a 4-year-old, they are not likely to be talking to you about hopelessness, but they're going to have stomach aches and they're going to have headaches, and their functioning can be impacted in other ways that are more appropriate for that age. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. So these are some warning signs. These are actual behaviors. We understand from the research that 4 out of 5 teens who attempt or die by suicide displayed some of these warning signs in the days, in the hours before they made an attempt. There is a lot of talk in the media right now about a series called 13 Reasons Why. So you're hearing about this from your students and from the media. And from the mental health community, there are some mixed feelings about this series. On one hand, it's bringing to light this really important topic, and it is generating conversations among children and adolescents and families and in schools and in churches and in youth groups. And that is very, very important. But there are some missing pieces in this series that are concerning. One of the things we know, for example, is it is not recommended that graphic displays or descriptions of a suicide attempt are discussed or shown. And if you have seen this series, you know that that was part of what the children saw. So we have included in your handouts some information about how to talk about and think about this series. By the murmurs in the room, I can tell that this is on your minds, and you're already probably wondering. These are some great tips about how to invite conversations with your youth. And I would say, from my experience with the teenagers I work with, they are not watching these shows with their parents. They are watching them on their own. And having seen the show myself, I was very impacted by the images and by what was missing, the opportunities for this girl to get help that were missed by the people around her. And so these kids are watching this and not having the opportunity to process it. So if you can be a place for them where they can talk about their experience and what does this bring up for them. Again, this handout should give you some tips on how to do that. Stop. So as I mentioned when we first started, we would like to give some voice to the youth who are experiencing depression and suicidal thoughts. Break Free from Depression is a documentary that Nadja and I had the pleasure of working on at Boston Children's Hospital, and for which Nadja is the executive producer. And this is a documentary that focuses on a diverse group of adolescents who share their stories in their own words and in their own ways, their experiences with depression and suicide. This is part of a comprehensive curriculum that schools are using for psychoeducation and to begin the dialogue about depression.
A lot of people don't realize that depression is actually like an illness.
I've had friends that ask me, do you think depression is real? Because I've had conversations with them about it, and they like denounce it. They think it's so fake, and I just tell them, like, wake up, dude. It's right in your face. Like, it's not just me, it's not just this kid, it's everywhere. You know what I mean?
There's so many different misconceptions and myths. Like, everyone always thinks teenagers are so dramatic about stuff, and they're like, oh, she's not really going through that, she just wants attention.
It's kind of like when you say like, oh, I'm dealing with depression. It's like, oh, you're dramatic.
People looked at it as, oh, he's being over dramatic. Why can't he just be like us and deal with it?
Dramatic.
Over dramatic.
When a lot of the times it's not like that. Like, a lot of the times the person really does need help, and people just don't realize it until like it gets too far. Areas where minorities live, the stigma is so huge there. People are basically just like, get over it, like, you're just going through something, like, just get over it and suck it up, when it's really not like that, and they really do need help. But people around them sometimes, such as like family or even themselves, obviously, they're just extremely embarrassed to go get help when they shouldn't be embarrassed.
Like, people don't really understand that it can happen to anyone, and it doesn't matter that I go to a good school, I play sports, I have a lot of friends. Like, I know I'm really lucky, I have everything, but I also have depression, and I can't like really help it. And it can happen to anyone, like anyone.
Say what you need to say. 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 Say what you need to say.
At this moment, countless teens are feeling sad, frustrated, angry, and hopeless. For many, these feelings are passing in a normal part of life, but for some, these feelings become overwhelming, long-lasting, and impact every aspect of their lives, which often signals clinical depression. An estimated 154 million people across the world are struggling with depression. In the U.S., as many as 1 in 5 adolescents will experience an episode of depression during their teen years. Yet as many as 80% will go undiagnosed and untreated. I'm Matt Light, and I play for the New England Patriots, and I want to introduce you to a group of teens and young adults, all with their own unique interests, talents, and dreams, and all struggling with depression. Through their stories, you'll learn more about the seriousness of this illness and how biology and life experiences contributed to their struggle with depression. What symptoms did they first notice? How did it impact their lives and relationships? How and where did they get help? And what do they do on a daily basis to feel better?
I'm a captain on the football team. I play D-end, trying to play linebacker. And I'm a captain on the track team. I'm actually a senior this year. Pretty excited about that. And I throw the shot put, and I throw the discus, and I run the relay race. And I'm 18 years old. I didn't know I was depressed. You know what I mean? I was told by a lot of my doctors that they thought I had been suffering from depression from a very young age.
I started at 6 being a dancer, and singing, dancing, and acting is my life. You know, here I was as 13, 14, 15 in a sports-related family, very much a sports family, being the artistic, emotional, sensitive child, thinking it was just me. It took until I was 22 years old to realize that it was on both sides of my family, both sides of my mother's family, and that it's something that we all have dealt with and that we'll continue to deal with together as a family.
Adam, he was my biggest fan. He'd say, Mom, go for it, go do it. You know, we did a lot of things together. We golfed together, which was fun. He was truly a Happy Gilmore golfer, but, you know, it provided us with a lot of fun. And, God, I miss the kid.
My name's Harrison, and I love music, and I write songs, and I produce beats. In sixth grade, I was depressed, but it all really started in elementary school, where I got beat up every day because I listened to rap music.
I play football, in which I'm a wide receiver and a cornerback, hockey, and baseball. Like, no one would say, like, oh, he's depressed because I'm walking around with my head down, but I was diagnosed and I was fine with it. It wasn't really a big deal to me. It was just, you know, as my mom said, it's like you're sick, you need, you know, you get help.
Today is Friday, May 2nd, my birthday, 18th birthday, and woke up, I was very emotional, so I cried. I never thought I was gonna make it to 18. I got diagnosed with severe depression when I was 7 years old. And the fact that I'm gay, the fact that I'm black, and the fact that I'm obese. Struggling with that has been like a big thing that shaped me, because I don't really meet too many people who have so many strikes against them all cluttered into one. It's so confusing.
My parents say that when I was 2, I started becoming very angry, but I was aware of this huge sadness that I had.
I'd sort of known that there was like a history in my family of depression.
I've been addicted to drugs. I've been addicted to alcohol. I've been locked up. Just like so much stuff has happened to me. And is it because I was a bad kid? Is it because I'm a bad person? No.
What triggered my depression was my anorexia that started in 8th grade. And then just a whole bunch of self-body image issues, just everything just all tumbled into one. And it's just all like, as time went on, it just got worse and worse.
You've just heard from people of different backgrounds and life experiences. As you can see, depression can impact anyone, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, or who they are. While not everyone's experience with depression is exactly alike, there are some common symptoms that adolescents typically experience.
All right, guys, get on and face that way. Face me, okay? Turn around, Gregory.
If you have like an actual like physical kind of illness, like people like kind of look at it differently than if you say that you have a mental illness. People just don't really understand the seriousness of it. Kind of, it's not just like, I'm sad. It's a lot more than that.
Literally, a chemical reaction is happening in your body and it'll make you feel a certain way.
I don't do much. I try to stay, I isolate myself pretty much. I don't eat as much. I don't work out at all. I just stay in my house.
There are times when, like, you know, my friends would call me up and say, yeah, we're going out. And I would say, you know, I don't really feel like going out right now. I just want to be by myself, you know, stay in my room, do whatever, you know. And, you know, people, I mean, I'd say like I'm tired or something like that, which usually wasn't the case.
So we'd like to give you a few minutes to gather in the circles of your tables, or those of you who are sitting around the edges can kind of group together and talk a little bit about what you just heard in this documentary, what you heard these kids telling us about their experiences. Is there a table who would be willing to share a little bit, a short bit about their discussion to question number 1? What was most salient about the adolescents in the documentary?
And just remember, we are broadcasting live and they can't hear you unless you're on this microphone. So just let me get to you when you have a report out from a table, wherever that courageous table is. All right?
All right.
All right, Christian
Thank
Tabernacle.
you.
We discussed the young black man that had the 5 problems, and we thought that was very problematic and started a brief discussion, but we weren't able to finish it because he had so many things with him that was wrong.
Did everybody hear that?
The heavy-set black young man.
Jacoby.
We thought that was a very, very severe problem because he had 5 things that he mentioned that was there, and that was an awful lot for a young adult to be struggling with.
So it sounds like really the combination of different things that he had, both circumstances in his life and reactions to the depression, really was something that stood out to you in terms of how complex these presentations can be. Thank you.
Does one more table want to answer that first question? What was most salient about the adolescents?
Sure. We were struck by how different the people were, but by how they all seemed to be experiencing similar symptoms in a way. So that really stuck with us.
And you probably heard they used some of the same words too. And those were their words, and they still come out the same way, despite the circumstances. How about question number 2? Did they remind you of youth you're working with right now? Does anyone want to? Okay, thank you.
Yes, it reminds me of several youth that's at my church. I have several youth that are actually part of same-sex couples. And I've had one to already commit suicide, and then another one has threatened it. And so listening to the youth story, but kind of particularly around the young man, the same young man, and sexuality, but now the youth are growing up, particularly young males who are coming up in same-sex couples of 2 females. I'm really sending with that group. Is the rebellion against it, but at the same time, the high risk of suicide without telling anything, without saying anything, and you really can't see any change in their behavior. Right, so that's something, yes.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up. One of the things that we now are thankfully getting more data on kids that... Can you hear me? All right. Maybe I'll just walk around with it, holding it. How's that? One of the things that now we really understand is that kids who are different in terms of their identified sexuality or questioning transgender are significantly at more risk of depression and suicide. And as a matter of fact, the suicide rates are 4 times larger than for heterosexual adolescents. And so we really encourage good communication about this particular vulnerability because it's really the ostracizing of them that's happening, the rejection, the questioning of their morality and faith and connection in light of who they are from a sexual perspective is really what's driving kids to feel completely isolated. So the more conversations that we can really offer them around that, it would be very important. There are a lot of resources around that are really focusing on providing crisis care to LGBTQ adolescents, and so I would really encourage you to become familiar with what resources are close to your own youth group so that you can access those.
Do we want to have one more response to question number 2? Run, Skip, run.
It seems like more and more kids that are coming up in life have things that, like their parent did drugs, so they come with a gamut of different things already against them, like with a lot more kids with conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, and it all in ADHD, and it all plays. It seems it plays a hand with. They have a lot of these symptoms, you know. So it just seems that, you know, these kids are starting life already with some strikes against them, and if the parents keep a blind eye on, you know, against it and don't get them the help, then, you know, it's a tough situation. You know, educating the parents, I think, is a big thing.
Absolutely.
It looks like, would you like to respond to that?
Even with the help, I've just finished working with a kid for 4 years. He died 1 month ago, and he had every help in the world. He had resources, hundreds of thousands of dollars with the state of Connecticut helping him. He had oppositional disorder. He was in Sandy Hook School when at the time of the murdering. He had every option. He just could not accept it or do it. So it's not like that the parents tried everything.
So, a couple of things, if I may. We often define depression as a family illness because it impacts the entire family, the entire community. So a lot of times we see generations of unrecognized and untreated depression. Right now for kids, at best, we're recognizing maybe 30%.
It's really hard with so many kids being adopted these days that you have no idea what they're coming from, you know, so you have blinders on. But
And so one of the things that I think, one thing you highlighted is kids are diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD. So I really want to invite you to think about how sometimes kids get labeled as acting out or, you know, behavior problems when in fact we're seeing more of the acting out part of depression. And this part of their experience is not really incorporated into what's going on. So I appreciate that you're bringing that up. And part, I think, of our charge is to be able to open up conversations to say, yes, behaviorally, really acting out, I wonder what else might be driving that. Regarding your comment, and I'm so sorry for your loss because clearly, you know, a lot of people were impacted, understandably so. And one of the things I would say is that unfortunately, we know that there's a very small proportion of people who will deal with very chronic, severe, and treatment-resistant depression. And that's unfortunately the reality. However, for the majority of kids and adolescents, the earlier that we identify this and the earlier that we treat it, the less the likelihood becomes, so that for that majority of kids. And that is not to say that there won't be some cases that are extremely difficult, but in general, again, we invite you to think about how can we recognize this a little bit earlier, because for those kids that really do respond to treatments, and we know there are treatments that work, they will respond in a much better way and in a much more long-term way if we catch it earlier.
I think one of the great tragedies of our time is the sheer fact that at the core of depression is some object is lost. And by virtue of our era, that we are suffering so many breakdowns and broken relationships, I wanted to know, what have you discovered in your research versus families who are suffering at such rate of brokenness for whatever reason, have you seen any rise in terms of depression related to broken families since children are separated from one of the parents or both parents? And on top of that, they suffer at the hands of the divorce and all the other relatedness. I'm wondering if that would be one of the major considerations to actual rise in depression.
So I'm going to take a shot, and then please help me too. Yes. One of the biggest risk factors for kids is loss of a parent, be it through death or separation, neglect. Those are really, really important components for kids. Loss of social connection overall and feeling like you're part of a community is a huge factor as well. And so we feel so incredibly blessed to be with you today, because if you think about traditional treatment modalities, they're very isolated, right? Somebody comes into my office for an hour and we talk and we have a connection, but that person is still alone in the experience. And so we need each other to create these communities where when there is something broken, where those social connections are missing, it's replaced by something else. So we do definitely see that loss of social connection, that loss of opportunities to practice being in relationships, making it through hard times in relationships and coming out on the other side. That definitely has some contributions to kids emotionally not feeling well. Is there anything that you would want to add?
No, I think that was a great answer. How about the last question we have here? What are your youth telling you about the spiritual impact of depression? Over here? Okay.
He's coming behind you.
Our table, we kind of discussed, in various avenues of working with youth, that some of the things we hear or see, or they mention that disconnect from their faith and disconnect from God, and mentioning that, if there is a God, or, if there is a higher power, they would love me and this wouldn't be feeling this way and I wouldn't be going through these things. And so at a time that they need it most, they're disconnecting and separating. So that's just something we'd talk about.
Thank you. And then there was one more over here.
Yep, I'm going to get the microphone. Thank you. Over, where are we? Thank you.
This course is very personal for me, but and my situation is, we tell kids sometimes, and young adults and all of us, just pray about it. Prayer answers everything. It's one of these click your heels 3 times, genie in a bottle, and actually they go to youth church and they say pray. They go to Sunday school and they say pray. They hear the sermons. We've preached ourselves in a corner to say that all you gotta do is just pray. You don't need medicine. You don't need doctors. They wouldn't tell a diabetic not to take insulin, right? They wouldn't tell someone who has high blood pressure not to take their medicine. But they tell those who have something that they can't really tangibly see or touch or feel, right? To just pray. And they look at you and say, but I am praying. I never stop praying. So why is it that my prayers are hitting the ceiling and I just need to pray harder and just throw my medicine away? Because I was told that after 9/11 when I suffered PTSD. Yeah, throw your medicine away. Just pray. You don't need medicine. And we just continue to say that and say that and say that and say that. Counseling? Who needs counseling? Talk to God.
Yeah.
Just tell God all about it. You know the hymn writer, he will hear your faintest cry.
So we're actually, you've taken us to the next slide.
Yes, thank you for that great segue.
That was awesome. We'll pay you later.
So there is another type of depression that theologians talk about. And this is different from the clinical depression that Kate and Nadja described. Theologians have called it spiritual depression, a dark night of the soul, as St. Jonathan of the Cross would call it. And for Jonathan of the Cross, he would say, this is an experience that all Christians eventually go through, and this experience is a spiritual emptiness, and the purpose is to experience deeper union with God. For many, this journeying through darkness serves as a vehicle to remove all the superficialities of faith. It moves us from the performances we've perfected to prove to God we are good enough or worthy enough to be loved. And it moves us to a richer, more sustainable understanding that we can do nothing that will ever make God love us any more or any less. That God's love is persistent, durable, deep, and unconditional. Even further, it perfects our love towards God by making God's love known to us. Now, what's interesting about the dark night of the soul, what's difficult about it is it's actually very hard to distinguish from whether it's clinical depression or whether it's a dark night of the soul, because these kind of feelings that you experience, they use metaphors of homelessness or God-forsakenness or feelings of meaninglessness, feelings of spiritual emptiness. These are the same type of symptoms that one might experience in clinical depression. And so it's really important and very important to say that all dark night of the soul experiences are a form of depression, but not all depression is a dark night of the soul experience. And what happens is sometimes our definition of depression becomes really narrow. It's either a dark night of the soul or it's clinical depression, and it creates myths and becomes really confusing. And my sister right here began to describe one of the myths. If you could just pray it away. Another myth that has been very popular is Christians with depression have weak faith. Has anybody ever heard that one? If you've heard that one before, raise your hand. And so what that does is it creates an environment that is no longer safe, that creates shame, that creates guilt, that perpetuates these feelings of depression, so that even when someone is experiencing depression, they won't talk about it. Now, you're adults in the room shaking your heads. So we can't even begin to imagine what our adolescents are experiencing if we won't go seek help because of the stigma associated with it. What are we teaching our adolescents? And so right now, I actually want you to spend a moment at your table reflecting on some of the myths that you have heard in your own context. And this can be in a congregational context, it can be more in a generalizable sense, but just talk about some of the myths around suicide and depression that really makes it difficult for people to actually reach out for help.
So who would like to share some of the myths that you discussed at the table? I heard over here. Here we go.
You speak. Oh, the term crazy, how the term crazy kind of labels that person and it sticks with that person and it really isolates you. And within a society where everyone wants to be professional and seen as having their business together, anyone that's seen that's going through depression is already kind of outed outside of the group, kind of kept outside of the norm. And particularly with males. Males, that's something that we really don't discuss because it deals kind of directly with our masculinity. Right, that's it.
So can I tell you a quick story related to that? I do a lot of workshops with kids in middle and high school to talk to them about depression. And I met with an all-boy class, 8th graders, and I said, what would you rather have? A diagnosis of depression or a non-fatal heart attack? What do you think they chose? And it was kind of like, well, duh, a heart attack. And I'm thinking, why in heaven's name would you want to have a heart attack? Well, because you survive it, you're strong. You can go on, nobody's going to question what you're going to be like in a relationship. Nobody's going to be afraid of you at work. But with depression, all of those things are true.
One myth that I have found in my senior high youth group is when there was an instance in their high school of a youth, 9th grade youth, who did commit suicide, and we were sort of debriefing it in my youth group. One of the young women who was friends with him was really struggling with guilt over something that she maybe could have done, could have said, if only she had known. And she was that was really weighing her down. And I feel like I could have had better tools, but one of my instincts was to say no, like there was, I don't know, like nothing you could have done maybe, or like, no, this is not something that you could have fixed for him or prevented. Certainly friendship is important, but I felt like it was something too big for her to take responsibility for. When it sounded like she was being a good friend to him. So I feel like that's sort of a myth, and I know it's a probably a normal reaction for people who are in relationship with somebody who is struggling with depression or does end up committing suicide to feel what if or what I could have done better, and I felt like that was just too much for a 9th grade girl to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So really the myth of I should have been able to fix it. Yes. So again, we'll talk a little bit later about this, but one of the pieces that we need to do is to be able to provide support for those who are supporting. I am certain that all of you have worked with kids who have the most amazing intentions and goodwill and want to really help others, but that feels like such a heavy charge that they end up really struggling themselves. So one of the ways to address that is to say, you know, how can we as a community be able to take care of one another rather than feeling like the sole responsibility is only on one person? Where'd the microphone go? Oh.
One of the myths that we kind of talked about is that Christian people don't get depressed. We never get depressed. We don't get sad. We're too blessed to be stressed. Okay? You know, it's that's one of the myths. And if we as adults are saying that, how are our young people going to be able to talk about it? And especially in the African American church, we were talking about it, saying, you know, it's taboo. You know, you can go to the doctor when you're sick, but if there's a doctor for your mind, and you're supposed to go to Jesus. That's you know, just like the sister said. So how do we expect when our young people do go, because you know young people aren't supposed to get depressed because they have no worries and no cares. Mm-hmm. There's nothing what do they have to worry about? Mm-hmm. And especially when you live in a city of New Haven who has one of the highest trauma levels that you can have. And so what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to learn how to really open yourself up. It's very difficult for the African American church to really, because it is taboo to go to see the counselor. You're supposed to go to your pastor. It's taboo. You're not supposed to do that.
Right, so how are you supposed to get help if you feel differently? You're stuck. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, one of the messages, I think, and I don't know if this messes with our theology to some extent, but, you know, when I became a Christian and I was my first year in college, some of the messages that I heard are, you know, you need to look happy, you need to smile. I mean, some of the songs that we sang, you know, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, you know. God wants you to be rich. I mean, that message that comes across by a lot of really, really well-known preachers, you know. God wants you to be successful. And I think that stuff sometimes messes with us. And we're not always going to be rich. We're not always going to be smiling. We're not always going to be successful. What happens if I get a divorce?
And one of the dangers of that is it sets up the sense that depression is a choice. That if you could just choose not to be depressed, if you could just change the way you feel, that you would do that. But we know that it is not a choice, and they are doing everything they can to feel better. So you're right, that is a very dangerous myth that we have to fight against.
Yes. Here he comes, right behind you.
Another myth that is known amongst the Black church is particularly that if you are dealing with suicidal ideation, it's because you are faithless. You are lacking in faith.
What a way to make you feel even more guilty, worthless, disconnected. Absolutely. So one of the things that we really encourage you to do as one of the tools of the work that you do with kids is help them to identify these myths. Unfortunately, some of these myths are really ingrained into cultural notions of mental health, what it means to have depression or not depression. Ask them what they identify as the myths. Ask them how some of these myths have then become opinions that prevent them from accessing help. And that's an incredibly powerful message, because I suspect that one of the things that you'll find is that they have way more connection around this than they think. I will tell you personally, as a parent, one of my myths was, I'm a child psychologist. There's no way one of my kids is going to have any of this, right? So we might be in a situation where we think, this is who I am, this can't happen. So again, inviting you to think, in your personal space, what myth might be holding your own conversation back. So one of the things we also want to invite you to think about is that internal experience. Now, we talked about some symptoms of depression, but we also heard that kids can be pretty good at keeping those symptoms close at hand so that they're not so fairly visible. And so what we need to start thinking about is, how do we start listening to some of the thinking and negative self-perceptions, negative perceptions about the world, and how can we start identifying that? So one of the pieces that youth really struggle with when experiencing depression is that there are these negative beliefs about the world in general. First of all, how do I even fit into this world? Why is this world the way it is? You know, there are so many obstacles, there's no way I can experience happiness. Now, when you think about that, where is the control? Outside of yourself completely. What a helpless place to be. There are also negative beliefs about the self. Who am I? I'm someone who's not adequate. I'm not as smart as this other person. I'm not as creative as this other person. I'm not meeting expectations that are set for me. And so we start to think, how does this negative belief about the self impact your emotions? Think about it. If you're feeling like you can't meet up to somebody else's expectations, like you don't fit in, that's absolutely going to have an impact on a youth's emotion. And then negative beliefs about the future. So if I don't belong, if this world is so full of obstacles, things are always going to be hard. So why bother? Why bother to change? And these are some of the things that I want you to start listening for. When youth struggle with thoughts like this, you're going to start hearing these absolutes in thinking. And they're often signaled by words like never. I'm never going to get out of this. This is never going to get better. Always. Things will always be bad. I will always be misunderstood. I will always be the outsider. Should have. How many of you have heard those should haves? Oh, I should have done that. I should have known that. It's that own sense of questioning yourself. And, of course, you want to think about why bother? That is a place that really tells you you're experiencing helplessness and hopelessness. So in a sense, we start by identifying these symptoms that we talked about that might be more visible, but we really want to invite you to start listening to language and to how kids are interpreting things in a different way, because that is indeed the window to how their thoughts are impacting their feelings. So traditionally, we think, okay, in depression, emotions are impacted, thoughts are impacted, behavior is impacted, but all of those things also significantly impact relationships. You heard the kids on the documentary say we isolate ourselves. We get into fights. We feel alone. And so we, in our roles as a community of faith and a community of flourishing, have a really important part to play in that square that talks about relationships. Because let me tell you something, inasmuch as somebody might be suffering, the buffering effects of a relationship can be that much more powerful. So, for example, we know that in schools, kids who are struggling with depression, yet find that they have really close relationships with their teachers and their peers, actually do much better than those who do not have that buffering effect of relationships. And you know how oftentimes you hear yourself going, well, so I do all this work, but then they go home, and at home things are really hard. How am I to make a difference when I'm feeling like I'm swimming against the tide? Do any of you ever feel that way? Here's another incredibly important finding from the research. A supportive relationship outside of the home, and this has been tested with teachers and students, can be so impactful that it can even buffer the negative experiences that are going on at the home. Please hear me when I tell you the work that you are doing and the relationships that you're establishing are not laid to waste once the kids go back home. Those words that you instill, that faith, that hope, bringing hope alive, is critical, and it stays with them. So please believe in the incredible power of your relationships with them.
So, why youth ministry? The grant that is making this lecture series possible is all about joy. And we all find joy in different ways and in different things. But as Nadja just pointed out, one of the things that we have in common as people is the need for community and relationships. This is something that is universal to everybody. I want to tell you about a story of a young man who was in the youth group that I grew up in and then later went back to lead for a number of years. And this was a young man who, despite many gifts, really struggled. And he found high school very difficult in many ways. So youth group, which we called YG, became his place, and those were his people. And at the end of the year, we always had, and still have, a youth Sunday where the seniors are able to reflect on their experience throughout their time in the youth program. And this young man stood up in front of the church and said one of the most powerful things that any of us had ever heard, and was able to articulate in a way that was so sincere and so real. He said, YG is a beacon of light in the storm of adolescence. And isn't that what we want all the kids to have? A beacon of light in the storm of adolescence.
I don't know why you're looking so down, because this is actually when it gets exciting. We want to introduce you to some of the kind of things that we've been developing through our conversations. And the first thing we want to just say is that youth ministry can be a community of flourishing. And that's exciting news. Macmillan says it like this: the sense of community is a feeling that members have of belonging, a feeling that members matter to one another and to the group, and a shared faith that members' needs will be met through their commitment to be together. And even as Kate and Nadja have already mentioned, youth ministry can really serve as what psychologists call a social support. And really, theologically, what a social support is, it's a relationship of unconditional love that provides a sense of belonging, a sense of worthiness, and a sense of security. It's a community where youth feel heard rather than judged, supported rather than alone, and safe rather than exposed. The presence of communities of flourishing seek to communicate to youth that they do have a life worth living. And we're really excited about what we're beginning to develop together. We're really wanting to spend time discovering and exploring what does it mean for youth ministry to be what we're calling a relational community of flourishing. And so this is how me, Kate, and Nadja have defined a relational community of flourishing. It is a pro-social, relational environment that supports youth trying to live with courage and resilience despite their circumstances. The community offers a consistent presence that nurtures the emotional and spiritual growth of each member. The community embraces youth as they experience and manage their emotions so they can retain hope and joy even when life is difficult or painful. Communities of flourishing are safe spaces that model unconditional love and empathy for self, community, and the world.
So would you mind raising your hand again if you are currently leading or participating in a youth group? Okay, so there is a wealth of knowledge in this room right now. And what we want to do is think about what are the essential elements of a community of flourishing. In your experience, what is important to your youth to make these a safe space for them to not just talk about, but experience and be loved unconditionally during any part of the continuum? So we're talking universally for youth who might never have experienced depression. We're talking about youth who are currently experiencing a crisis. And we're talking about youth who have come back to the group after experiencing a crisis. So what are the essential elements of this community where they will feel loved rather than judged, where they will feel supported rather than alone, and where they will feel safe rather than exposed? So please take a minute in your groups and talk about what those essential elements are.
So just tell me one essential element.
One of the things we talked about was just providing a space where these students, these youth, know that they're taken seriously, that whatever their experience is, that it is taken as a true reality for them.
What other essential elements do we have?
Confidentiality.
Confidentiality.
We talked about the need for peer leaders among the youth to help when the kids that don't really fit so well might get picked on some, or at least teased by the others in a way that could cause more depression, more of a feeling of isolation. That some of that can come from the leader, but some of it, I think, could come from mature youth leaders. I mean, among the youth themselves.
So changing the ethos. Do we have about two more?
So I think that we need to deal with the youth, the children, and the place that they're standing right now. So whatever problems that they're having, we need to not judge them, but stand in that place where they're standing and help them to get out of that situation that they're in.
Accompaniment. One more, I saw one more hand. This will be our final. Okay, you'll be our final, so we have two more.
Since youth are going through a process of exploration, often questioning their faith, we need to communicate that you don't need to believe to belong.
Amen.
At our church, we do have a good youth population. And what we have found, not only do you have to extend to our youth love, but there's also trust that they need to have in those that are around them. They would even come to church, and as they come to church, they will seek those adults who they find comfort and love with, and they will look for you. And some of them sometimes just want you to give them a big old hug. And they're good for the day.
Give yourselves a hand clap.
What? So yes, you get an A+ for your contributions. The next two slides we have up here outline some of the essential elements of communities of flourishing. And we recognize that in your groups, you probably are already doing a lot of these things. Some of them maybe intentionally, and some of them maybe more organically. But as you are looking at your group dynamics and you are wondering what are the things that you are already doing within your group, and what are things that you can do to strengthen the communities of flourishing, we have a couple of questions on your handout at the bottom that can just be a starting point of discussion. One of the most important things in creating these safe spaces is peer leadership, so thank you for bringing that up. And their voices must be heard in creating these safe spaces. If we want to create places for them to share their pain, they have to know that they will be heard and not judged, and they will be unconditionally loved and accepted. So their voices must be part of this process in developing the community ethos.
Okay, so we'd like to talk to you a little bit about what are some of the skills that can be incorporated into creating this. So we've talked about incorporating their voices, we've talked about sharing, but you know what? Sometimes sharing without an understanding of what the support is can be difficult. I really have a hard time when I hear of like high school assemblies that have an open mic and people just basically get up there and share very dark or deep-seated difficulties that they're having, and there's nothing after that. And everybody's just left like, what just happened? So we invite you to think about and co-create with your youth what is the framework for sharing. How are people going to be supported and held and feel like there is a sense of containment, that the sharing is not really flooding them, but it's actually helpful. As you mentioned, somebody mentioned confidentiality. That's also a very important piece to consider, but also what the restrictions are on confidentiality, right? And so really thinking about what is our responsibility when somebody is at risk. Our responsibility is to maintain their safety first and foremost. But I think for kids, it's important to know that first. I haven't worked with any adolescent that has been, that has not shared with me how he or she was feeling because I shared those limits of confidentiality. I think, as a matter of fact, they were really helpful to hear. Disclosure. How are we going to disclose something that is difficult or painful with others? So really thinking again, when you're co-creating the narrative of what your space will look like, you'll want to invite the kids to think about when somebody discloses something very seriously, how do we want to then either reference it or not reference it? What are their wishes around that? So really thinking about just because something has been put out there, it doesn't mean that the person perhaps would want that to be the sole topic that then identifies him or her. And finally, what will be the response? There are a lot of responses that one can have in terms of whether it's a mild concern that you have, and in which case the response is respectful curiosity, right? Tell me about what's going on for you. I noticed that you seem a little down. Do you want to tell me? Do you want to share? How can I be helpful to you? We also want to really think about what are our own resources that we have accessible when we're worried about someone being more moderately or severely depressed. How are we going to access community resources? And one of the things that I think would be incredibly helpful is to create a list of what providers are around you, what crisis centers are around you that you can really resort to in a moment of dire need. And if somebody's suicidal and they've had to leave your community group because they needed to receive that kind of treatment, how are they going to be integrated back into that community? This, I want to point out, coming back after a hospitalization, either into a school setting or another setting, is a really strong point of vulnerability for kids because they're trying to figure out how to come back after what's happened, who are they after what's happened, and how will others see them. So you really want to think about what are your responses, what are your supports, and how are you going to manage having that person be reintegrated in a way that respects their dignity, their desires about what to share or not to share, and that really proves to them that despite the difficult circumstances, they're still cared for and loved and valued for who they are. Okay. So in terms of crisis response, we wanted to share with you from best practices what are some of the things to say and some of the things that are not helpful to say. From a reaction to suicidal crisis, we really, really encourage you not to ignore or dismiss the issue. Now, ignoring or dismissing happens a lot typically by peers, right? Because they say, you know what, never mind, I didn't even mean to bring that up, just don't even think about it. When somebody brings it up, it is an invitation to say, I'm in real pain and I need someone to hold that space with me. As many of you might know, when someone is in a suicidal crisis, they don't really want to die. They're actually, that is not their goal. The problem is that they're in such distress that they see no other way to end their pain other than to stop living. So we need to understand that they're in the middle of that ambivalence, and so ignoring the issue or hoping that the part of the ambivalence that wants to live will take over and not do anything about it is not a sufficient response. Challenge, debate, or bargain, or preach, or panic are not helpful, but of course, because we have good intentions, those are the first things that usually come out of our mouths, right? But why? But you have so much going for you. You're so smart. Everybody really likes you. We all care about you. Now, of course, we're trying to establish that relationship, right? But to the person who's in crisis, their thinking is, all those things you're telling me, I can't feel, I can't access. There must be something really wrong with me. So, keeping this a secret, trying to convince someone out of it in that moment is not helpful. What is helpful? Show you care and be genuine. You must be in such incredible pain. I thank you for sharing that with me, and I will do everything I can to be able to hold this with you. Okay? Ask questions directly. Don't be afraid to don't be afraid to address the issue directly. I have found that sometimes when you say to adolescents, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Oh gosh, no, I don't like pain. I would never do that, right? And that's a euphemism for, are you thinking about killing yourself? But in their minds, they're like, why would I do anything that's painful? They have a different idea of how to take their lives. So it's important to say, are you thinking about taking your life? Don't leave the person alone, right? And don't leave yourself alone. Dealing with someone who's in that state of crisis really needs people working together. Get others involved immediately, and say to the person who's in crisis, I am so glad that I can be here for you and that you've come to me. Some of the things that are really difficult for kids to hear are, I know exactly what you're going through. No, you don't. Or, well, at least think about it. At least you have this. That's not empathy, that's sympathy. People need empathy from you at that moment. You are in this really dark place. I'll be here with you. Okay.
I was, when I first got here, I was pregnant, and my colleagues threw me a baby shower. And maybe like a couple weeks ago, I went back and I read one of the activities they did. One of the activities was writing what their hopes were for my child, for Acacia. And a young girl who was there filled it out. And one of her hopes for Acacia was, I don't want her to be afraid of the dark. And when we started talking about depression and we started talking about darkness, I never looked at that statement the same. And so right now, as we've turned out the lights, I want to ask you a question. When it's dark and you're walking in the hall, what happens to your vision in the darkness? What happens to your vision when the lights go out? I actually want you to respond to that. What happens to your vision when the lights go out?
Drawn to the light.
Drawn to the light. What else happens to your eyes?
Well, your mind plays tricks on you, so you can see things that you would recognize in the light very differently, and those things can frighten you or, surprise you or scare you.
You strain your eyes and desperately try to see. Your eyes get bigger and you just keep trying to look.
You use all of your other senses and you overthink things.
could turn the lights back on. It's interesting, when I was looking this up, what they say is basically your pupils begin to dilate and all the light that's around is drawn into your eyes. And so a lot of times when the light goes off, somehow our eyes begin to adjust just a little bit, so that even though it's still dark, the darkness doesn't change. But sometimes the difficulty of walking in that darkness, once our eyes begin to adjust, does change. And one of the concepts that we're working on together, beginning to create, is we want our youth to have night vision. We want them to be able to navigate the darkness. Because the reality is, some youth may actually, this may be a lifetime struggle for them. We don't know. Darkness may be their reality over and over again, and they may have to navigate that night. And what we want to say, it's possible to still have a flourishing life, to still experience joy when you have night vision. And so this is what we want to begin to instill in our youth, the ability to navigate the darkness. And I would venture to say, as Christians, we have something to offer this conversation. John 1:4-5 says, "What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." In our scripture that we've been using throughout the week, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." One of the really big things that we do to help instill in our youth night vision is really what Antonio and Grace had begun to say earlier. We reveal to our youth, yes, it may be a myth that Christians should always be happy. That's a myth. If you look in the Bible, depression is all throughout the Bible. We can think about Elijah, after he had ravens had fed him, after he had done miracles for the widow's son, actually raised the widow's son from the dead, called down rain. He went aside and then talked about wanting to die. 1 Kings 19:4 says it like this: "He prayed that he might die and said, 'It is enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" That sounds like suicidal ideation to me. What about Jonah? During his darkest moments, what does he say when he is on the run? "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, 'Ah, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country?'" Then he goes on to say, "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." That sounds like suicidal ideation to me. And so I just want to clarify, even with our friend King David. Psalms 88, "But I cry to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, Lord, do you reject me?" And then you see, from my youth, I've suffered and been close to death. I've borne your terrors and am in despair. He goes all the way down and said, darkness is my closest friend. It seems like depression is in the Bible to me. And so one of the things that we have to do is begin to say, look, depression is something that has happened for a really, really long time. And we have resources to begin to navigate depression and darkness. Depression cannot have the final word on our lives. And so we want to talk specifically about enhancing night vision.
So what are some ways that you can enhance night vision for the kids? Well, you can tune in to their feelings, right? A feeling of unworthiness. And the thought is, I am not enough. How do you respond to that?
And so we, in our communities, we provide what is called relational affirmation. And when a youth says, I am not enough, our relationships in this community of flourishing says, hold up, baby. You are not loved for what you do. You are loved for who you are. And that practice is unconditional love.
When the feelings are complete isolation and the thought is, I am alone.
Our response is we will walk alongside you. We will bear your burden. That's the practice, bearing each other's burdens.
And when the feeling is hopelessness, homelessness, and feeling I do not belong.
The relational affirmation is, oh yes you do. You are part of this family. The practice is hospitality and acceptance.
And through these relationships and these practices, you guide your youth through the light.
So as Sarah and Nadja and I have been working together and looking for the ways that theology and psychology come together, one of the things that we have been finding is that we are talking about the same things. The language is different. The words we are using are different. And this is one of those places where there is a beautiful intersection between the two fields. In psychology, we might call these coping skills. In theology, we might call them practices of flourishing. And when you are loving someone who's in pain, most of us want to know, what do we do? How can I help this person, this young person? And we wanted to give you some ideas of things that you can encourage them. And again, these are ideas that you can be teaching your youth universally and during a crisis.
And so one of the things that when we began to kind of create this list together, the thing that we both put on there is contributing, service. That instead of reaching in, how about training our youth to reach out and begin to help and begin to kind of contribute in a different way. Another one is gratitude. It's really easy to think about the things that are not well or are not good, but gratitude is an attentiveness to the things, the gifts that God gives, the blessings that's in one's life. So gratitude is another way.
Another piece is, I'm sure you've all heard mindfulness. Mindfulness has really become a very important part of treatment, and to me, prayer is being mindful. It's a part of being in peace and in touch with who you are and a higher power, and that in and of itself is a practice of mindfulness.
And you may remember that model that Nadja showed, the cognitive behavioral thought model, which is thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Some of the kids that you're working with aren't going to be at a place where they're ready to change their thoughts or their feelings. They may not be able to do that. But behaviors sometimes are where they can start taking steps towards feeling better. So encouraging them to do things that they find some pleasure in still, listening to music, watching movies, exercising. The research tells us that is hugely powerful in combating depression. Good sleep habits, we all underestimate how important a good night's sleep is and how it can help you think more clearly and feel better. Journal writing, finding hobbies, talking to adults and friends, taking those little steps towards feeling better even when they aren't thinking and feeling better yet.
And also narrative therapy, which is used across intersection. A lot of pastoral care counselors call it restoring, where you become really skilled in asking youth questions about their story and then helping them to really rewrite their narrative and rewrite themselves as agents and protagonists inside their narrative so that their future is no longer foreclosed, but they're literally becoming a participant in creating their future.
And finally, on the top, we have put supporting the supporter. Nadja mentioned this a few minutes ago, but this is crucial. In order to be able to help the kids that you love, you have to take care of yourself. You have to find ways to share what you're experiencing and help with the emotional impact that loving people who are in pain can have on you. This is a must that you need to do for yourselves. Teach your kids how to do it for themselves, because they are also the supporters of their community, of their peers, potentially other people outside of that community as well.
So we come to the conclusion that we really cannot approach emotional health and wellness from a silo perspective. It cannot be just psychology. It cannot be just spirituality. To address the whole person, to address their mind, their spirit, their body, their souls, we really need to come to a place where we work together. We understand each other's perspectives and complement it, and we create a community of flourishing that promotes these wonderful things, these feelings of belonging, of spiritual fullness, of intimacy and purpose and learning. Now, we are so grateful for your time. I realize that we're stepping a little bit outside of our due time, so we want to draw your attention quickly to some resources. There are a number, and these are listed on your handouts as well. There are a number of national helplines and hotlines that you can access, as well as some Connecticut-specific information. There's also a list of recommended reading that you can either share with parents, with the youth themselves, really thinking about what further resources and information they can use.
So let me just ask a quick question. How many of you wrote a question down on the card that you actually got answered? Raise your hand. Okay. That's good. We did pretty good. We didn't expect. How many of you came up with new questions after we went through our presentation? Raise your hand. So what we want you to do is that card that you have is write down whatever that question is, and please do not leave with that index card. Give it to one of me, Madeline, Camille, give it to one of us, because we're going to incorporate that into our collaborative chapter as well as the curriculum that we do. Do we have any time for questions? Can we take one or two questions? Okay. So we'll take one or two questions if anyone would like to ask.
So when you were talking about, I take it almost as a warning sign, when the kids start talking about universal terms, always and never and so forth, I would think you would want to somehow confirm their feelings without endorsing the feelings. I mean, what would you do if a child said, oh, it's never going to get better, you know, I'm always going to be in this, you know, how would you then turn that without invalidating what they just said?
You know, I come again to this part of respectful curiosity, which is, tell me more about why you feel that way. What experiences have you had that bring you to this conclusion? So you're really respecting what they're feeling at the moment without invalidating, as you said, that finality of what they're saying.
And so we'll take one more question.
What are we missing early on to prevent this rise that we see in our youth? What could we do as parents, or maybe what have we done wrong as parents, so we can address it earlier? How can we cultivate healthy habits and lifestyle and church life early?
So I think that's a really, really big question.
That's a big question.
One thing that I think we live in a very success-driven culture, and that success-driven culture can also show up as performance-based. I have to do this to be a good Christian. If I don't do this, then, so I think just watching the kind of messages we give our youth about how they're valued, like how they're valued. So, yeah.
So because I'm a parent, I'm like, I want a concrete thing too. So a very, I think, useful thing that I work with parents around, and I have to remind myself about, is that often we bring to attention an outcome rather than a process. Hey, you got an A, good job. Instead of, I noticed how hard you were working today, and I noticed how much you invested into completing that. And so a lot of times we get caught in what the outcome is or what the performance is, as Sarah indicated. And I think one of the things I would say is encourage to pay attention to the process, because it is through that kids build their self-esteem and internal motivation.
So we're actually, we have to come to a close because it's it's coming to 9 o'clock. I just want to remind you tomorrow to come early. Do you have announcements? Okay. To come early, 5:45 tomorrow. Okay. Well, we have a closing blessing, so.
Before they close, if you think this is one of the most effective presentations on one of the most important issues your children face by three of the most gifted, loving, creative people, could you join me in thanking them? And as they say on the old television shows, stay tuned to this station, because they're moving from here to writing up the scholarship, to writing up the curriculum, to delivering it to your churches to change the world. Stay tuned.
Okay. So we would like to do our closing blessing. May the peace of Christ go with you wherever he may send you.
May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm.
May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you.
May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors.
Be blessed.